Welcome. I'm Anna Kosu, curator of the How to Move a Zoo exhibition, and this is my colleague, Dr. Jackie Neerling, assistant curator on the project. We are speaking to you today from Gadigal country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Sydney Living Museums acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening in today. We'll now share our screen.
Thank you for bearing with us. Where's our PowerPoint? There we go. The How to Move a Zoo exhibition reimagines the long-forgotten story of the move of hundreds of zoo animals through the streets from the Zoological Gardens at Moore Park in Sydney's eastern suburbs across the harbour to the new purpose-built Taronga Zoological Park. The exhibition was inspired by a collection of digitised glass plate negatives from the Government Printing Office held in the New South Wales State Archives. These photographs give us rare glimpses of Sydney's first public zoological gardens at Moore Park and capture the early years of Taronga, which opened in 1916.
Sydney Living Museums exhibitions are grounded in deep research to bring to the surface engaging stories and, in the case of How to Move a Zoo, make them accessible to a family audience. Jackie and I will delve into the archives to explore what led to this remarkable event in Sydney's history. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat and we'll answer them at the end. I'll hand over to Jackie.
Since time immemorial, people have formed complex relationships with animals as subjects of fascination and curiosity, for scientific understanding, and as companions, protectors, or beasts of burden and potential sources of food. Early colonists collected specimens of birds and animals to send home and to keep as pets. Governor and Elizabeth Macquarie, for example, kept a collection of native birds and animals in the domain at Parramatta as pets, but also as a form of education for their young son, Lachlan. Intrepid travellers and speculative traders brought an array of exotic specimens to the colony as curios or for commercial sale. And newspapers abound with advertisements for public viewing of exotic animals in venues around Sydney and as touring shows. We should note here that our research does not encompass circuses, which suggest choreographed performance. Mostly they were menageries with animals in cages or perhaps brought out on a leash. In the 1840s and 50s, the Australian Museum acquired and displayed various living animals, including a tigress, a grizzly bear, a native dog, 2 eagles and an emu. But the museum found the upkeep of live animals onerous, and while there was talk about forming a publicly funded zoological garden, as zoos were then called, the collection was handed over to private operators, William Beaumont and James Waller, who had since 1851 operated a zoological garden and pleasure ground at the Sir Joseph Banks Hotel in Botany Bay. The hotel has since been refurbished as flats, and some of its grounds are a public park, complete with an elephant sculpture and zoo animal-themed children's playground. It's quite fun to visit today. To promote their gardens, Beaumont installed a menagerie for public viewing in the southwestern corner of Hyde Park near the racecourse. Admission was 1 shilling and children 6pence. The menagerie included the first ever elephant seen in the colony, the only one of these ponderous animals ever landed upon the shores of Australia, their advertisement boasted. The Botany Bay enterprise continued until 1861, when the animals were put up for auction with no further detail on their fate. Sydney's Botanic Gardens also housed a collection of birds and animals, where the succulent gardens are now located. The collection was popular with visitors, but the display was deemed in 1868 a trifle too pretentious to dub it a zoological gardens. Most of the collection was owned by the Acclimatisation Society, which had scientific research interests, but they were also interested in introducing imported species of fish, birds and game into New South Wales for commercial and recreational fishing and hunting purposes. Criticism arose about the Acclimatisation Society's material interests, and the educational value of the collection was questioned. But the displays remained a public feature in the Botanic Gardens until 1883. By this time, as dedicated zoological gardens had been established at Moore Park, and the bulk of the Botanic Gardens collection, which by then included monkeys and a cinnamon bear, was handed over to what would officially be Sydney's first public zoo.
In 1879, the newly formed New South Wales Zoological Society was given permission by the City Council to occupy a small parcel of land at Moore Park on the site known as Billy Goat Swamp. It is now the site of Sydney Boys and Sydney Girls High Schools. It was tiny, just 7 acres, and despite additional land being obtained in later years, at its largest it was only 15 acres. By the time this image was published in 1882, the grounds had been laid out, the central lake formed and fenced, a caretaker's cottage built, and aviaries erected. The Society's collection was only small, a combination of exotic imported animals and native animals enthusiastically donated by the public. Even in these early years, it was primarily for the benefit of Society members, who were mainly upper-class landowners and learned gentlemen. But they opened to the public free of charge on Sundays, though this was stopped after larrikins ran amok in the gardens, trampling the flower beds. To increase revenue, the Society decided the gardens should be open full-time to the public with a modest admission charge. In 1883, a public appeal for donations to purchase an elephant was initiated with the funds raised matched by the government. At the same time, in exchange for some native plants and 2 emus, the King of Siam gifted a male elephant, later named Jumbo, who arrived in July 1883. Jessie, purchased from Calcutta Zoological Society, arrived in December of the same year. The arrival of these 2 elephants gave the infant zoo draw-card animals and an important source of income via the extremely popular elephant rides. The Zoological Gardens at Moore Park, also known as Moore Park Zoo and Sydney Zoo, officially opened to the public in 1884. Moore Park was the site of entertainment for the growing population. There were refreshment rooms. For the first 10 years, well-known Sydney identity Kong Tart operated his Chinese pavilion tea room. There were band performances, animal rides, shelters and lawns for picnics, gardens to admire and relax in. The gardens were seen as an important element of the zoo. A 1906 publication called All About the Animals at the Zoo states, "Enclosures filled with animals do not quite constitute a zoo. Something beautiful in plant life and landscape gardening is needed to make harmony by showing the other side of nature's works. It would make the zoo more picturesque and interesting and be a credit to the already attractive city of Sydney and popular with the public." The strong connection between the botanical and the zoological continued with the Taronga. In 1886, over 125,000 people visited. This number included free admission that was extended to school children and charitable organisations, indicating how the Society viewed the zoo as a place of instruction or learning. However, despite its popularity, Moore Park Zoo faced many problems. In 1887, living up to its former name of Billy Goat Swamp, a period of heavy rain brought extensive flooding, wiping out plantings and keeping the public away. The zoo continued to experience many more flooding events throughout its history. In 1902, bubonic plague was found in the wallaby population. The zoo was forced to close for 4 months, adding to its financial difficulties. Modelled on the London Zoo, the way animals were housed was typical of the time. Small barred cages with concrete floors. There was no space to roam and nowhere for the animals to hide from visitors who crowded around peering through the bars. The lion cage that we can see in this image measured just 4.5 metres across and 1.5 metres deep. Evidence of the old Moore Park Zoo and its cages have survived in the school grounds. The two bear pits where visitors could view the grizzly bear from below and above. By the early 1900s, it was evident that Moore Park Zoo had run out of space. It was hemmed in by trams on two sides, making the site dusty and noisy, not ideal for a recreational day out or the health of the animals. And increasingly, both members of the Zoological Society and the public questioned how the animals were housed. The zoo was cramped and dismal for the animals and crowded for visitors, and not seen as worthy for the city of Sydney. Looking for government support, members of the New South Wales Zoological Society appealed to the Chief Secretary on the basis of civic pride, declaring, "These mean and unhealthy grounds are not worthy of this wealthy state or of this great city. It is the ambition of our council to see Sydney endowed with gardens as excellent as those of other cities, of the same high grade as our other public institutions, the Sydney parks, museums, libraries and picture galleries. A search for a new location began."
The first formal mention of relocating the zoo is in the Zoological Society minutes held in the State Library of New South Wales in 1902, when a special committee was appointed to look out for another site. Bladesville was suggested, and a newspaper article reported that the Parramatta Progress Association, similar to today's Chambers of Commerce, were keen to have the zoo in Parramatta Park, an echo perhaps of the Macquarie's menagerie 80 years earlier. The process appears to have languished for a time, but it really hotted up in 1909, with several sites being considered, including several sites on the eastern coastline, Little Coogee Bay, the Wonderland site at Tamarama, and 70 acres near Rockdale. Others were on the Upper Lane Cove River, Harris Park near Parramatta, at Tempe on the Cooks River. But Long Bay at Maroubra was the hot contender and posed strong competition to the site we know now was successful, the site of Taronga at Bradley's Head, which was officially granted in 1912. As Sydney Living Museum's members, you may find it particularly entertaining to imagine a zoo on the Vaucluse House estate, which was also a potential candidate. Papers in the State Archives show that the residents and investors in the recently sold off Wentworth landholding strongly and passionately objected to the idea and submitted letters and formal deputations to the Premier. This was a popular news story in newspapers of the day. Positioning the zoo at Vaucluse or Bradley's Head aligned with the government scheme that came into force in the early 1900s to secure public access to harbour foreshores for recreational purposes. Bradley's Head was by far the better option, offering over 30 acres, which was later increased to 60 acres, compared with the 4 acres proposed at Vaucluse. The Mossman Progress Association was in full support of the Taronga site, but there was concern about whether a site on the far side of the harbour was prudent. There was, of course, no harbour bridge. But funding was given for a dedicated wharf and ferry service, and tram lines were extended from North Sydney and Mossman to facilitate access. The zoo's director, Albert Sherborne Le Sweff, was a driving force for the Taronga site. Le Sweff took up the position at Moore Park in 1903. He came from a zoological family. He'd grown up in the Melbourne Zoo, where his father and later his older brother was director, and another of his brothers ran the Perth Zoo. Le Sweff passionately embraced modern views on zoology that advocated for animal care and welfare, rather than the arcade-style form of entertainment. Documents in the State Archives reveal that Le Sweff had his eye on the Taronga site at Bradley's Head as early as 1907, 5 years before it was formally granted in 1912.
The new zoo was carefully planned, taking advantage of the natural rocky slopes and preserving as much of the bushland as possible. Under the instruction of the director of the Botanic Gardens, 2,000 additional native trees and shrubs were planted. We can see in this image remnant bushland and the new plantings. With ambitions for a world-class zoo, in 1908, Le Suef was sent on a fact-finding tour of zoos around Europe and returned inspired by the private zoo in Germany run by the animal dealer Karl Hagenbeck. Hagenbeck zoos featured large, barless, open-air enclosures that mimic the animal's natural habitat. At Bradley's Head, Le Suef had the space to create a new purpose-built zoo, adopting these revolutionary ideas. The small cages and pens were replaced by open-air barless enclosures. Animals could roam and climb, while a deep moat or rock wall prevented them from escaping. There were no bars to obstruct visitors' views. In 1913, Le Suef submitted a plan to the trustees of the newly formed Taronga Zoological Gardens Trust, outlining the principles on which the new zoo should be built. We can see in the State Archive photograph Le Suef's vision realised. Every exhibit can be viewed from 2 or more sides, which prevents undue massing of the public before the enclosures, and animals were grouped in species. So on the slide on the left, you can see a series of monkey enclosures. The new enclosures were designed to resemble the animal's natural habitat. These enclosures were constructed using the site's natural rock formations and artificially created rock. And in the case of the seal pond, an imitation iceberg was built from white cement. Taronga took 4 years to plan and build, and newspapers of the day followed its progress, publishing regular articles and images. The making of the zoo and moving hundreds of animals, including Jessie, the 4-ton elephant, through the city from Moore Park and across the harbour to Taronga in 1916 captured the public's imagination. It provided a welcome good news story during the traumatic years of the Great War. So we'll leave you at this point of the story and invite you to visit the exhibition at the Museum of Sydney, where we have playfully reimagined this remarkable move of the animals. So we'll turn it over to questions now.
So we'll just see if anybody has put questions into the chat, and we encourage you to add yours if you have any.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Louise. How did the public respond to the idea of barless enclosures?
Well, there was a bit of debate, and the newspapers had a great time with this, you know, posing the questions of, well, you know, what's going to keep them in? What's going to prevent them from escaping? And in fact, there were some escapes, weren't there?
That's right. So as the zoo was being built at Taronga, each time an enclosure was completed, the Suef organised to take some trial animals over. And we know that in the monkey enclosure, one monkey was put in, he promptly escaped. Well, I think it was a he, could have been a she, promptly escaped. And that actually meant Le Suef had to change his design and actually build the walls of the monkey enclosure higher. So as Jackie said, there was lots of information given in newspaper reports of the day. And it actually, for some of those sites that Jackie was talking about being considered for the zoo, that was one of the great fears. If we were going to have no barred cages, then, you know, they all feared these animals escaping into their neighbourhood.
So Louise has put another question in. Oh, did the war have any influence or effect on building Taronga?
It's really interesting. So Taronga started, the construction of Taronga started before the war in 1912 and continued right through, actually, after it opened, it continued to sort of being built in 1917. The war actually had a really interesting effect on the zoo. There's not much said about the construction. It doesn't seem to have delayed the construction, but what it does mean is some of the animal keepers at Moore Park enlist, so we lose valuable sort of staff at the time. So Jackie, there was a story about the move of the elephant in terms of the animal keeper.
Yes, so there was Jessie, of course, who was guided across by her keeper from Moore Park. But there was another elephant at the zoo named Dundry, and it got nicknamed Jumbo sometimes, a bit of a generic term for a big male elephant. But Dundry was a bit fractious and sort of a bit cantankerous, and they wanted to move when the elephant sort of temple-like elephant house was completed. They wanted to move him in there, but his keeper had been called to war, and they were very reluctant. They weren't really quite sure how poor old Dundry would cope with a new home and a new keeper all at once. So they had to appoint a new keeper for him and gain his trust before they could move him.
And the other story about the war, which is a really interesting one, is that in May of 1916, the Moore Park Zoo was still open. There was a request from the military authorities if they could use the animals, the camels at Moore Park, to train the soldiers on how to mount and dismount a camel ready to join the Camel Corps in the Middle East. And this permission was granted. And in fact, the military authorities said it's okay if the public actually watch these soldiers learning how to mount a camel.
And actually the war, the zoo itself, the new zoo at Taronga, became a recreational site for visitors to Sydney, which included travelling soldiers. And there are some wonderful images in the Taronga archives of soldiers from New Zealand on Jessie, I think. So obviously it had a sort of motivational, or how would we say, sort of goodwill role to play as Sydney dealt with what was going on with their war heroes.
And the other story around the war is that in 1916, just before Taronga opened to the public in October of that year, the government actually extended free admission to children of metropolitan Sydney, school students. And you can imagine this was actually not just a way of promoting Taronga, but also as a much needed respite from the sort of traumatic years of the war. So up to between 100,000 and 120,000 school children actually made these free visits to the zoo. So, that would have been an amazing thing. Okay, the tricky question, how long did it take to move all the animals? It's a really interesting question because despite all of our research, the move of the animals seems to be the one that actually isn't as well documented as the building of Taronga. But what we do know is that the move was incremental. So as I mentioned earlier, as enclosures were completed, they started moving animals over. But over a period of about 6 months, they start to transfer animals. There's a beautiful story of the first animal to be moved to Taronga Zoo. It was actually back in 1912 at a ceremony to sort of mark the beginning of Taronga. A sugar glider was actually taken over in a keeper's pocket, and that was reported in the newspapers as the first animal. We know that the move of the animals really did culminate with the move of the largest animal at Moore Park, and that was Jessie the elephant. And in the exhibition, we tell a great story about Jessie. So she actually really did walk through the streets of Sydney, the streets that you know very well, across the Domain, down Macquarie Street to Bennelong Point, which is where the vehicle ferry was there waiting for her. And then she actually had a trip across the harbour in a 90-minute journey.
And again, the newspapers had a great time with this. And I think they really were looking for feel-good stories in this sort of, what could otherwise be a dark and gloomy time, relating back to the war question earlier. But they talked about it being Operation Noah's Ark. So although it mightn't have happened in a grand parade, animals were being ferried through the city or carted through the city in various sort of cages and on lorries. There is it's probable that the camels, for example, followed a similar path to Jessie because they'd just be too physically big to fit in a lorry safely. So it would have been really quite a spectacle for people. And for Jessie's journey, for example, every single street she walked down, from Moore Park through, Flinders Street, Burke Street. We know those streets so well today, across the domain.
And we also, in the exhibition, we try and reimagine what the sounds would have been like of those wild animals being moved. They were moved in the early hours to keep them calm and the public safe. And we know that the public joined in the parade behind Jessie. There were stories. We've just been recently contacted by someone whose great-grandmother followed Jessie on her journey from Moore Park down to Circular Quay. So it was an exciting time, as it would be today if we saw an elephant on the streets in our suburbs.
And there's a great story that I think was recalled by one of the trustees later on in a speech later on, where he said that Jessie, as she made her journey, upset the early morning milk delivery, which of course was a horse and cart, and the horse freaked out and caused chaos at the sight of an elephant roaming down the road.
Yes, and so there's one more question, I think. At the start, which animals were most popular, foreign or local Indigenous animals?
That's a really, really good question. And I think we make a lot of fuss about what we think about zoo animals today as being the ones from overseas and the sort of African safari type animals. But surprisingly, the local native animals created a lot of interest, and they were very useful for education because, we are really talking about, this is the late 19th century, and Sydney was very urban. So a lot of people didn't have access to, kangaroos and possums and those sort of things unless they lived on the sort of city fringes. So those animals created a lot of, they were really, really popular. They created a lot of interest. And I think the society was very proud of them. And there was this big exchange, it's amazing how many animals were crossing the equator and coming in and out of port because Australian zoological societies were sending native animals away in exchange for ones from overseas.
And of course, the most popular animal at both Moore Park and Taronga was the elephant. There wasn't probably a child in Sydney, I don't think, that didn't have a ride on Jessie either at Moore Park or over at Taronga during her long life. That's all we have time for today. I don't think there's any more questions. Thank you again for joining us. The How to Move a Zoo exhibition is open at the Museum of Sydney through to the 24th of April 2022. And the museum opens on Thursdays to Sundays, 10 to 5 p.m. For more information about the How to Move a Zoo, please go to our website. The link has just appeared in the chat. And don't forget to keep an eye out for more member exclusive talks that will commence in February next year. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.